Lesson 10. Acrylic landscape with a painting knife. This presentation has been prepared as part of project Boosting Positive Narrative on Romani Integration through Arts. Almost every painter who uses oil or acrylic paints will have a palette knife, also can be called as a painting knife, in their artist kit. Painting knife can be used for a lot of things, like mixing paints together and applying paint from tubes onto palettes, creating a broad array of textures by scratching, blowing, mixing paint, slashing, dabbing, sweeping, and more, smoothing paint to a nice finish, sharpening edges. You have great control with a palette knife and can easily affect a very clean, definite edge or a more broken, blurry, or otherwise indefinite border. Making lines and shapes. Creating gradual transitions. Depending on the angle of the knife, you can control the amount of paint you lay down, going from heavy to very light. Layering and or laying down vibrant colors. Painting with palette knives has a long history, and many of the world's most famous painters have used this tool. Palette knives used for applying paint has a relatively recent history, as until the 19th century, these tools were primarily just for mixing paint on the palette. A few artists here and there, including Rembrandt and Francisco Goya, used palette knives in addition to brushes and other tools to create a nice effect, but it wasn't really until the 19th century when Gustave Courbet started using them to thickly and smoothly apply paint on his landscapes that the technique began to really grow in popularity. Other well-known artists who used palette knives for painting include Camille Pissarro, a student of Courbet, Paul Cézanne, Marc Chagall, and Henri Matisse. Many of these artists used palette knives in addition to brushes and other painting tools. It was in the 20th century, however, that more artists began to experiment with painting and artwork entirely using palette knives. Many artists today who use palette knives dabble in a bit of both methods. Metal palette knives with a wooden handle come in different sizes and shapes. The size of the blade directly correlates to the painting effect you can achieve. A short blade produces sharp angular strokes. A long blade allows you to put down sweeps of color. A rounded blade is ideal for dabbing spots of pigment and building up layers. And a sharply pointed blade allows you to scratch into the painted surface to create a graffito effect. Avoid using plastic knives, which might be fine for mixing but aren't robust enough for applying paint to the canvas. Invest in slightly more expensive metal knives from the start. For palette knife painting, acrylic is the best. Because the paint will be applied thickly, you need to work with a paint that won't crack while dry. Plus, the consistency needs to be thick enough for spending, not just dabbing or washing, as you would with watercolors. When painting with a palette knife, the ideal surface is canvas or wood, but you can also use thick art. No matter what, you need a surface that won't buckle under pressure. Here are 3 steps to painting with a palette knife. The first step, start and mix your paints. Palette knives are better than paintbrushes for mixing acrylic paint because they allow you to be more precise with the amounts of each color. On a smooth palette, mix the paints you want to use into the desired color combinations and variations. The second step, practice with swatches. Begin by applying paint with a palette knife onto a practice swatch. Apply paint using different pressures and with different sweeping, scrubbing, and dabbing motions to see what you get. If you want to avoid the common mistake as you start painting with a palette knife is applying the first layers too thickly. Applying too much on the first layer will result in cracking, peeling, or even paint that never fully dries. So build the thickness up gradually instead. The third step, paint on canvas. Now you can work on your canvas. If you are starting a blank canvas from scratch, you might want to plan your painting first with some preliminary sketches in pencil to guide you as you work. Landscapes need not be painted on the spot. Many fine paintings are made from sketches and photographic reference. But when weather permits, there is nothing more enjoyable than working direct from the subject out of doors. There are some specific issues that have to be considered when creating landscape paintings. The focal point. Most landscapes have a center of interest or focal point to which the eye is drawn. How obvious this is depending on the scene. Examples of an obvious focal point might include a group of buildings in a landscape, a tall tree, or some people sitting down having a picnic. People always grab our attention because we identify with our fellow humans. A less obvious focal point might be a plowed field, making a pattern in the middle distance, a particular hill, a gleam of light on a lake or river, or a light tree set against darker ones. Creating space. A landscape will not look convincing unless you give the impression of space. And there are two principal ways of doing this. One is to observe the effects of linear perspective correctly. Everyone knows that things become smaller the further away they are, but it is easy to underestimate this effect. You know that a field or a faraway lake is a certain size, and you fail to realize that it is tiny in relation to the rest of your picture. It is wise to measure such landscape features when you make your preliminary drawing. Hold a pencil or paintbrush up at arm's length and slide your finger and thumb up and down it. In this way, you can establish the size of the distant lake in comparison, for example, with a field which is closer. Light. Moreover, to landscapes, paintings need to emphasize to the light. You need to visit or to take pictures in different time periods during the day before the pattern of light and shadow makes it visual appealing. One of the most important things is that you need to capture the right light conditions, the amazing architecture, and the warm pastel shades that you can create as well as illustrating the reflections. Now, let's move on to the next lesson, named Figurative Compositions or a Portrait.